Hello, hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of Skeptics and Seekers Sunday Sermon. This is 4S. I'm David Johnson. Let's get started with Sarah. How you doing?
I'm good. Very well, thank you. How are you?
I am very, very good. Now, I'm trying a slightly different setup, which should have me making better eye contact to the extent that I can make eye contact at all with the camera. The thing is, the picture of me and you and what's going on is on a notebook, and it's like 2.5 feet below the camera. So what I want to do is this. And so if you catch me doing this, audience, I'm just watching the film, and then I will try to remember to look up from time to time at the camera. I will figure out video one day, but you know what? I figured it out enough to hit the go button, and I can't wait to get started with this particular show. Sarah, I just got to tell you, I've got to confide before I hit the start button. I don't think that there's going to be another show this year that I am as excited about as this
You're
one.
pumped. You're pumped for this one, are you?
I am so pumped. And it's not because I'm in such a great mood or I've had such a great day. I haven't. I'm not. This is acting, people. No, it's because of the subject matter. Deconstruction has been kind of a thing for a while. I think, as far as deconstructions go, and as far as argumentation goes, with deconstruction, this is maybe the best compendium of arguments put together in one place on the internet. Period. Bar
Okay.
none. Bar none. And I've watched the entire internet. I've even watched my stuff. This is really good. Now, part of the reason why I think it's really good, this may be a little self-serving. I've been saying these things for years. I've been saying,
We've all been saying these things.
I,
He reiterates everything.
I feel like Tyler has dug through my stuff in particular and just put together a set of arguments. I know this is not what happened. He does not know I'm alive, except for the one exchange that we had on YouTube. He does. He did not know I was alive before that. So, and by the way, he appreciated our show and our comments
Ah,
on the last one. So hopefully he will watch this one too.
okay.
I really should have continued communicating with him. So,
Yeah.
Tyler, hey, if you're out there, skeptics and seekers at gmail.com, hit me up in the email and let's talk. We got to get you on the show. Tyler, right now, I know, because I've been there, I know that he does not want to be the poster child of deconstruction. That is not what he is looking for. He does not want to be praised and lauded by hardcore atheists like me. This is not what he was going for. But I'm sorry, Tyler. You have made an extremely good case. And this show might go a little long, but I just want to point out uh, all of the, well, maybe not all, but a lot of the little details that often get missed in these conversations. And I thought that Tyler did a good job there. There's some things that Tyler says that I will want to push back on. And so, in all fairness, I will do that too. I think that you and I have, a little bit of conversation around at least one of those things coming up. So, without any further ado, as I figure out how to switch over, um, I will tell you, guys, I barely watch these videos one time through. Some of them I don't watch one time through. I just kind of scrub through to make sure that it is what I'm looking for. I watched this video probably 5 times. So this is very unusual for me. Let's get started.
On this episode, I'm going to go through part 2 of the intellectual reasons for my deconversion. This is a rather large scripted show. I had a lot I wanted to say, and I wanted to get it down on paper the way that I wanted to phrase it. I do have some episodes coming up in the next coming weeks dealing with issues like divine hiddenness, divine determinism and compatibilism and things like that. So please keep your eyes out. We do have a couple episodes on the books. There is one coming up this Friday with Matt Salih. I think I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce his name. I've only ever seen it in print, and I know I've heard it, but I don't recall. But I have that episode coming up this coming Friday evening.
So just for the listening audience, kind of redundant if you're the audience, you're obviously listening. This is not part 1. This is part 2. I know that there's a part 1. I have chosen to skip part 1 on purpose. I've listened to it several times. It's a good beginning to the explanation, but I found it a little bit too theophilosophical for my taste, and I think that everyone's going to really appreciate the meat and potatoes punch of this one. And so we'll let Tyler continue.
For those of you who are in California time, it's about 8:30 p.m. California time. Sorry for those of you on the East Coast. Okay, so with that, I want to jump in and go through some of my comments about, my recent deconversion. This will be the last episode I do specifically about my deconversion, the reasons for it. Here on out, the content is going to be these issues that I bring up. So talking about divine hiddenness, I'll have content about divine hiddenness. It's not really going to be tied to my deconversion anymore. So just so you all are aware of that. But this is the final part 2 that I wanted to get to. Okay, so with that, also please leave your comments and your questions. I will interact with them at the very end, whatever's in there. If you have a question, put it in all caps questions, and I'll read it when I get to it.
And on that, we do not have the part where he goes into questions and comments, so he ends the video. Just before that, I have read the comments below the video, and the comments from the Christians are frankly embarrassing. Christians, do yourself a favor, listen to this, read the comments, and don't do what the other commenters did. That just makes you look bad. It hurts your cause. Tyler?
To it at the end. Okay, so with that, in my last episode, I began laying out the intellectual reasons that led to my deconversion from my long-held Christian beliefs. Primarily, the issue that I laid out had to do with the way Yahweh in the Bible seemed out of accord with the high view of God, of the God of classical theism. And considering that I think we have very strong arguments for classical theism, and one of them had to give, the very terrestrial, very finite, capricious behavior of Yahweh lost out. That was the bulk of the last episode.
It was, in fact, the bulk of the last episode. Sarah, I am sorry I caught you at an awkward moment. So that will not be edited out because I can't. Sarah, did it ever occur to you, when you were a Christian, that the God of the Bible seemed really, really concerned with mundane human affairs?
It did, which is why you suddenly start asking questions. But some of it is also very normal. You don't always question it either. I mean, it dawns on you slowly that maybe this is weird, but most of the time you're just like, well, this is God.
Right.
What else do you want to do?
You know, at some point, someone maybe should have asked, why does he want men to cut off the tip of their penises?
Yeah, they should.
You know, this seems like it shouldn't be a subject of, well, he said it, so I guess we got to do it. There should at least be some kind of reasonable connection with, by doing this, you make yourself healthier or some such. I don't know. Why should God care if you eat shellfish? Shrimp is delicious. It's not bad for you. Why
It is. I'm highly allergic to shellfish, so and that's why I was told it was a bad thing to eat because
Okay, but
it's
a lot
full
of
of
people are highly
toxins.
allergic to peanuts. They could eat nuts, so I don't think that it had anything to do with allergies or health. Why does God care if you wear clothes made with more than one fabric? You know,
I think they were just laws for the Israelites, weren't they, at the time? So
well, but
I never thought they were.
right,
Yeah, I don't know.
but
I
why?
just
But why
remember
should he
thinking it was.
care even about for the Israelites? What?
He shouldn't. He really shouldn't. But he, it's just you kind of. I don't know. I parked it as something that happened in the olden times, and the things were different then. He was very visual and manifest, and you saw him. But along with that came lots of rules and regulation, and it was all part of the law based system. And that it's only when Jesus comes along that all that goes. Never crossed my mind that it is all of it until you start deconverting.
I
But
mean, it
this is
wouldn't.
the job
It
of the
wouldn't have.
apologist.
Right. It wouldn't have
Flip.
made sense even for the people at the time, though. I mean, so it's you can't say, well, it makes sense to people way over there a long, long time ago, because it wouldn't have. Even then, they should have asked, why do you care what fabric our clothes are? You know, it's just a
Wow.
terribly mundane terrestrial kind of thing, as Tyler was. This is the kind of thing he's talking about here, and I just think that this is one of those things that Christians don't spend any time thinking about because they're in this mode of thinking, well, God said it, I believe it, so that ought to settle it.
Yep.
And it just never occurs to them that your God is really fucking creepy because he will absolutely kill you if the tip of your penis isn't cut off.
But in this episode, I'm going to give other reasons that cause me to question, doubt, and finally reject Christianity. However, I'd like to first add that I acknowledge that none of the arguments or objections or data points that I mentioned last time or will in this episode are a singular defeater for Christianity.
I'm sorry. Why did he even make penises with the part that he doesn't like? I'm sorry. I can't get over this. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
There isn't a silver bullet that I think falsifies the Christian faith. Rather, it's similar to the cumulative case for Christianity.
I was circumcised. I feel like
sharing is caring. Oh my God.
I feel like
There's Judaism. It's nothing to do with Christianity. I mean,
okay,
we were told that was
tell that to my parents.
Oh my God.
I was circumcised as a baby. I mean, it was now my oldest brother wasn't. I don't understand where they picked up their Judeo concern about circumcision with me. But, I'm sorry. I'm just stuck on something that's not important and that Tyler isn't even talking about. But it's my penis, goddammit.
It was just a sign that you were part of the Jewish clan. I don't think I didn't really think about these things.
Did you know that he would kill you if you didn't do it?
No.
Yes.
No, where does it say
In
that?
fact, he almost killed Moses. I'm not going to go back and do the reading. Christians who are very familiar with their Bibles know exactly what I'm talking about. Right, Christians? So Moses hadn't yet been circumcised at a certain point, and God was getting ready to kill him, and his wife intervened, and they got it done. No, this was a do it or die kind of thing. Yeah, no, it's crazy.
It's crazy. I can't even justify it.
I don't know what I'm missing. Some people tell me it's very important. And so why is anyone born with it? I mean, right? Did we grow that foreskin because of sin? Were we not created with that foreskin? So why did God change his mind and suddenly say, yeah, I don't like that little bit after all?
It's a heap of arguments and evidences and improbabilities that finally piled up to the very gates of heaven, only to find the throne room empty after all. So it's not as though there was some singular fact or argument that falsified my Christian faith. And I still don't think that it's somehow demonstrably false or foolish or irrational or anything like that, or anything like what many online atheists will claim. But I found the pile of objections just became so high, and the sheer volume of explanations needed to dispatch them so great that I could not overcome them all, or at least the sinking feeling that the whole thing was a put-up job. In addition, many explanations were in conflict with one another and with other explanations that were needed to hold other parts of the rug down on the other side of the worldview room, or at least they caused tensions for other answers such that affirming both didn't seem satisfactory. For example, that actual infinities could not exist to defend God as the creator who created ex nihilo in the finite past, with the Christian conception of heaven as a potentially infinite set of experience, but for which God would know completely, which would be an actually infinite set. Or the contrast and answers of God being all loving and wanting all to be saved, then drowning all humanity in wrath.
Okay, so I just want to make an observation right now, and I think it's going to play out throughout the entirety of this video. One thing that a Christian, especially a progressive Christian, might say when they're hearing this is that his objections are not really about God. His objections are about the Bible. It's about Bible stories and how they depict God. And so, maybe Tyler has misplaced his disappointment and disgust and disillusionment. And so if he only had a different, more progressive view of the Bible, then most of these things would go away. So Tyler actually deals with this a little bit later in the video, but I still think there is some room for that observation that really what he's talking about is a certain understanding of the Bible in certain depictions of God. Not all Christians see God this way and see these events this way. So I just thought I would make that clear. Now, that said, I think that Tyler is talking about the God of the Bible exactly the way mainstream Christians think about the God of the Bible. This is how I thought and understood the God of the Bible. Sarah, I think the same was true for you.
I probably wasn't aware of all the Batty stuff. To be fair, it was just like, yeah, Yahweh's a bit stricter, but I wasn't aware of all the Batty verses. And the thing I don't understand is his job was apologetics, so it's kind of he goes towards the faith and understands the faith through the eyes of apologetics, where he's having to come up with or research the reasons why these things make sense. So I don't understand why they're coming up now as these seem really crazy. These are Looney Tune contradictions, and it's like, yeah, that's true, but that your job also need to work out, or your I don't know, is his hobby or his actual job, but was to find ways around all this stuff. So
right, but
I don't understand why it's a news flash at this stage, because for me, yeah.
Right, but most
Christians, I don't think, know this, how crazy some of the laws and things are, and
I don't think it's a newsflash. Yeah, I don't think it's a newsflash for him. I mean, he knows about this stuff. He knew about this stuff the whole time. He just had counter arguments for these things. And so what he was saying earlier, I mean, if you just take each one of these things in isolation, and this is kind of what the Christian would do when they hear this, they will say, okay, this, I've got an answer for this. And then they'll move to the next one. This, I've got an answer for this. And they'll go on and on and on, taking each one of these things in isolation. But what he's saying is, at some point, he couldn't take these things in isolation. All of these things accumulated And the mountain of excuses he had to make by way of explanation started to feel thinner and thinner and thinner until it finally was incapable of supporting what it needed to support. So I think that's how he would answer that. But he will get into that a little bit more.
But the difference between him and a, say, normal, regular Christian is that he knows these things from the outset, whereas I discovered the crazy stuff as I was deconverting. It was like, oh, God wants to chop off the end of penises and blah, blah, blah. And this is the reason why, it doesn't sound so great. But you discover it as you're deconverting. Mostly you think Jesus is love, and blah, 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 God is love, and etc. And he beginning, but I understand it becomes so much of a mountain of excuses. But for most people, they're not even aware of all these crazy verses in there, because then there's never any real sermons about the crazy stuff.
I don't know that that's the case. I grew up with the crazy because I grew up a preacher's kid, and I think that a large percentage of the people in the church grew up in the church. That's why they are Christians and not Muslims. It's a product of where they came from, and so you hear these stories as a child. And they are sanitized and normalized so that you are trained to not even think of them as weird or unusual, So, once you get it fixed in your head that God is love, and then you hear over here that he destroyed the entire world with a flood, except for 8 people who turned out not to be so good themselves. You work that into the narrative of God as love. You're not looking at that in isolation and thinking, oh, that seems bad, because it's God and nothing God does is bad. And so what you're doing is you're working that into the framework of God's love. And that's how you view these narratives. So, the Christians definitely know this stuff. They know the broad brushstrokes of this stuff. I would say that the average Christian, they know enough things that if they just looked at clearly would be enough for them to walk away. But it's underneath this blanket of narratives, and the blanket came first. So
just kept thinking, okay, but if I, as a sinful father, and I can still love my children, even discipline them, but not punish them to the point of utter extinguishment, surely God, who is love, would be able to do that. Remember, God isn't just maximally loving on the biblical view. God is love. Whatever love is what God is. So even the creator-creature distinction doesn't work here, because God does not seem to get a special out on this one for being God while we're not. Because if I'm properly loving my kids by not punishing them to that degree, and that is what love is, then that just is what God is.
So I think this is an incredibly good point, and it's one of those standalone points that if Christians really thought about would be enough to deconvert them. As a parent, it's never okay to kill your kid. It's just, oh, well, they did this bad thing, so I have to kill them. Not only does God kill his kid and his children generically, as all of us as his children, as punishments, he actually commanded in the Old Testament parents to kill their children for various reasons. Very specifically, to a parent of a child who dared suggest they consider a different God, that the parent have no mercy and be the first to pick up the stone that crushes that child's head in. That's God's command. Now, granted, a lot of Christians may not be aware of that particular verse, but they are aware that one of God's punishments, if you do not please him, is that he will kill you. And somehow we have worked that in our minds to be, oh, well, that's okay. Obviously, you deserve to be killed if God kills you. but he's a loving father. And those two things live in the same head in perfect harmony.
Because you can't even give yourself permission to even go there with those questions, because you are told straight away that your ways are not not his way. There are good reasons for it, and you don't know what they are, and he's a just God as well. And so you can't even to question those things and to start thinking about them. You have to give yourself that firstly that permission to do it, which you're not supposed to have. So the exit doors are shut before you even can explore out in the outer world, because that's the way it's created.
So God couldn't be loving in a different way than us, and in fact, in a diametrically opposite way of us, because insofar as we love, we just are reflecting God more. But here, I love my kids by precisely not exterminating them, even when they deserve some kind of punishment. But that's just an example, and I'll get to more later. I'll continue laying out some of the obstacles again, but I want to remind my audience that I'm not here giving all of the reasons for or against these objections. Remember, like in my last episode, I'm not fully interacting with these ideas and handling rejoinders or engaging the responses that could be given to them. I'm simply going to handle these in more detail later, and I've thought about these things in detail over the years. So please don't think that I'm just like ignoring them or whitewashing them. So for the sake of this episode, I'm simply laying a broad case for the kinds of reasons that led me to reject my prior Christian faith. In addition, I want to address a common accusation that I've received in places where I've started to discuss these issues recently, and that is people saying that I've become an atheist, or I'm using the same arguments as atheists or atheistic arguments. Once again, I'm not an atheist. I believe there is one God, a creator of all things, omnipotent, omniscient, transcendent, spirit, immutable, ase, simple, and impassible, and even providentially guiding all of human affairs, living and active. I'm a theist, and a classical theist at that, through and through, and pretty unashamed about it. I'm not even a deist. So to say that I'm an atheist is not only wildly uncharitable, it's honestly just dumb.
Okay. Right. So what is he? What kind of God does he believe in? He says he's a classical theist. So I looked this up. I thought I knew what it meant. So I'm trying to figure out, well, classical theist is kind of like maybe a god of the philosophers, maybe with all the omni characteristics, creator, grounding of all being, kind of God without being a personal savior kind of God. I was having trouble imagining the kind of God that he believed in.
I was almost like, is this some sort of idealism? And I looked up whether a classical theist could be some sort of idealist, as in, the ground of all being type view. And I couldn't, I can't say in depth, but I couldn't, there might be some parallels. I just don't understand why you have to land there other than as a stepping stone, because most of the problems are still there. All the divine hiddenness, the problem of suffering, just the point to God, what he says, he still thinks he directs our lives a little bit, and providence and all that kind of thing. And I was just like, it's pretty much God, but just with the nasty bits taken away. So I didn't really understand how he landed there quite.
Yeah, now, so let me say something that will surprise some, others it won't surprise because I've said it before. When I realized that I no longer was a Christian, I also still believed in God. So despite the fact that it's probably a kind of a loony position overall, it's a very natural place to be. You don't necessarily, and I guess it's different for everybody. I think it was different for Andrew. He just kind of walked away all at once from everything. But a lot of the people, most of the people that I've talked to who have deconverted, left in pieces, bits and pieces at a time, not all at once. And so, yes, I realized that, first there are certain Christian doctrines that were probably kind of minor that I believed in. I thought they were more important than they were, and I stopped believing those. And then there were some Christian doctrines that were more major and were important to Christianity, and I realized that I stopped believing in those. But, you could still hang on to some version of Christianity. And, a few steps later, okay, Christianity, that doesn't make sense to me. I realize I don't believe it and I shouldn't call myself a Christian, but I still believe in God. There's, lacking theism doesn't mean you lack God. The Jews believed in God. They weren't Christians. So I still believed in the God of the Bible, and that, and at some point I believed, okay, the God of the Bible is real, but he's a dick. And so I can't worship that God. And then came maybe the God of the Bible isn't real, but maybe some version of God is real. And so I hung on to that for a little bit. And so it was actually stages and stages before I finally said, you know what, I have no reason to even believe in any kind of God. So that took a while. So I feel him and where he is right now, and I certainly don't want to minimize where he is. One mistake that I hear atheists make when someone deconstructs and deconverts, they're coming out in one of these earlier stages, and we hard-bitten atheists say, well, you're practically out the door anyway. You're 1 foot away from full-on atheism or whatever. You shouldn't do that any more than Christians should claim that it's some kind of phase. No. Both sides are wrong here. And so I don't want to minimize this stage of Tyler's journey. But Tyler, if you're listening, I would say that there are probably some more stages of your journey that you're going to have to face at some point down the road. And, it is, among all things possible, that you can stay exactly at this place where you are in your journey. And that's fine. But a lot of us have been there because this is normal to come out still holding on to some form of God belief. And it, over time, that gets chipped away. So I'd just be curious to see how his journey progresses. But please, atheists, don't make the mistake of dismissing Tyler's theism in the same way that Christians dismiss his lack of belief.
It's a good point, actually, that, David, because it's true. It's and people's journeys don't end in the same place, do they? They might, as you say, you might stay as a classical theist or become something else, or deist or whatever, and it worldviews overnight. So you're trying different hats on for size, and for a little while you sort of think, I can get behind this idea, and it's given you so much in your life that you are going to not let go of it in one go. So I just don't understand if a lot of the things he brings up, I sort of think, well, that applies to any sort of God generally. But yeah, I mean, the Yahweh being a bit of a dick is probably the easiest one to give up on, because it's so obvious when you see it that you're just like, this is idiotic. Progressives can come and help you with, well, that was just the ancient people's understanding of the divine, and it doesn't actually mean God was like that, and they probably had it wrong, but they, that there's an arc overall and that kind of thing. You can save those kind of views, which is where we all pass through a progressive stage at some point until we drop off the end sometimes, but where he might just end up somewhere in the middle. It doesn't matter. It's fine.
Right. It's his journey, and I respect that journey. I respect people's journey when they're full-on Christian right-wing nutjob theists, because I've been there too. I have been as crazy as the craziest person that I talk about on the internet. So I've been there. I understand that. And so I guess it's a little bit easier for me to just kind of take people where they are and, recognize their humanity and all of that. And also recognize that we change. We grow. And you have no idea what you're going to believe 10 years from now, Sarah. Neither do I. And neither do you.
Mm-hmm.
So,
amen to that.
Yeah.
But am I making the same arguments as atheists? Are they atheistic arguments? Well, I'm making the same arguments, but they're not atheistic arguments. I don't think that they're atheistic, and I'm not an atheist. I don't think atheistically. I do now have some serious objections to Christian theology and the overall biblical view of the world, specific passages, biblical theology, and so forth. And these objections are shared by theists like myself, deists, polytheists, agnostics, and atheists alike. Anyone who rejects these aspects of the Bible will have similar objections. But does that make them atheistic? No. And is there some kind of guilt by association defeater to my objections that can be validly levied by saying that, that's the same objection that atheists give? I mean, not if you want to give reasonable responses that aren't just logical fallacies. I mean, imagine an atheist was debating with you as a Christian, and the Christian used the kalam argument for God as an example. Let's say you use the kalam. Would it be meaningful that for the atheist to say, well, you're just giving an Islamic argument because the kalam was first proposed by an Islamic philosopher? I mean, that would just be a silly rejoinder. So too, I'm giving objections to what we see in the Bible and theological inconsistencies, even if atheists also use the same argument. That simply isn't a valid defeater to say, well, that's just an atheistic argument. Okay, so with that out of the way, let me dive into a few more of the main reasons that I came to reject my previous Christian worldview. First, I began to notice a lot of inconsistencies or amalgamations that just became so messy to hold and to defend that they caused me more questions than answers. And often the questions weren't of the, well, that's interesting, I wonder what lays below the surface of that variety, but were rather of the, okay, but how is that even coherent variety? I started to call these blessed inconsistencies, and examples are things like the Trinity, the hypostatic union. Jesus's teaching, which was very kingdom focused, had a high emphasis on Torah keeping, was very eschatological and very soteriologically underdeveloped, versus Paul's highly systematic, very soteriological, almost no mention of the kingdom, and nearly Torah rejecting theologized view of the gospel. Honestly, the gospel of Jesus in the gospels and the gospel of Paul in his letters seem like they weren't even talking about the same thing sometimes.
So I feel contractually obligated to say that this is exactly the type of thing that we are talking about on Red Letters Season 2. You know where to go. Patreon.com/Red Letters. Contractually obligated. I wrote the contract, but still, obligation is obligation. But this is, I remember a discussion late in Season 1 with Peter, and I was talking about how different Paul's teachings were from Jesus. And he was saying, well, maybe there's a difference between Paul and Luke, but he didn't see a difference between Paul and Jesus. And so I tried briefly to explain some of this because I knew that I was going to be talking about this in Season 2. And so, for anyone who is unfamiliar with the fact that Paul and Jesus preach a very different message in a lot of ways, maybe just roll this back to when he was just talking about that and give it a listen. Every bit of that is true. And the way Christians read the Bible, they don't recognize the differences. So they think that it just flows smoothly from Jesus to Paul and everything is fluid. That is not the case at all.
In your denomination, do they even make much of a distinction between that? I mean, to us, it was all Bible, so whether Paul said it or Jesus said it didn't really matter.
Oh no, yeah, Jesus,
it's only
Paul,
on the way
same
out.
thing.
Yeah, same thing. So it's only on the way out. It's only say, oh no, actually, there's Paulinian views and this, that, and the other. You're like, what? Okay, no, I mean, again, he knows almost too much because of his background in apologetics. But most people wouldn't be overthinking this. They'd be like, Yahweh's batty. There's lots of inconsistencies over it. And also why he has to have labels as to what he actually is any more than. We're not Descartes, we're not Kant, we don't have to work it all out. You don't have to have a label. If you don't worry about it, you don't have to settle on theistic, classical, this, that, and the other. Just be like, well, I don't know. It's fine. We don't have to know all this.
So he's
overthinking it.
Tyler's about to rapid fire through a few things, and I'll try not to stop every 3 seconds, but it's going to be really hard.
And the later general epistles didn't seem to fit either of them. In addition, I started having problems reconciling the Trinity. Again, not in the apprehension versus comprehension way, but in the that actually seems logically incoherent way.
Okay, and that here I can't. Yeah, it is logically incoherent, but I would just go back because he's trying to say that the trivial way that atheists object to the Trinity is not valid, but I would say it is valid. Apprehension versus comprehension. So apprehension is just a way of saying, okay, I know that this is a fact that is true. And then comprehension is I understand how this can be. So apprehension, I can turn on a light bulb. Comprehension, I don't know how it works. So yeah, I flip the switch, light comes on. I apprehend that stuff is happening. I don't comprehend it. So this is kind of how Christians talk about the Trinity. And, many of them land in a place where you don't have to comprehend it. You don't have to understand it. It's not understandable. And I would just say, let me stop you right there, brother. Because at that point, you are preaching a kind of doctrine where you're saying disengage your brain. And this is a huge red flag when someone starts talking about apprehension versus comprehension. No, you should comprehend the things that you bet your life on. These types of beliefs, you should more than just accept faith statements about Trinitarian beings. If you don't understand it, you need to be able to ask questions. And then if the answer is, well, you're human, you're not supposed to understand it, just shut off your brain and nod along, that should be a big red flag to you.
Quite. I mean, you can study it for years and still think it doesn't make sense and you can't understand it, and yours is not to question. Or you can just pass over it like the atheists, as he suggests. Go, duh, that doesn't make any sense. Not buying it. Yeah. You can both enter in the same place eventually. It's just to what degree you want to go digging into it. It doesn't make sense, whatever. And even people who've studied it for years can't quite understand it. And that's not a plus. That's not. It's not necessary. It doesn't mean it makes it more valid. The fact it's incomprehensible, it just means it's incomprehensible. That's it.
Right. And Tyler, he's going to lay out his objection to the Trinity, and yeah, it's very intelligent, but it's not a better objection than, yeah, duh, that doesn't make any sense. So that is also a valid objection.
And I don't mean that in the trivial ways that many critics of the Trinity would propose, like, well, if God is three persons, then you're saying it's three gods, and that's a contradiction. No. The distinction between one what and three whos seems entirely valid to me. I get it. So that's not the issue. But what did and does seem problematic was the relationship between the three, and talking about things like the eternal generation of the Son or the procession of the Spirit, but of which causes problems for the view. But then, if I don't accept those things, like the Eastern Orthodox churches don't, then drawing a distinction between the persons becomes problematic, especially in light of Jesus's comments that he does come from the Father and he does send the Spirit. And all of those things cause huge problems for any meaningful conception of divine simplicity. Now, the open theist and the non-classical theist will agree and think that we ought to jettison classical theism. However, as I stated last time, I just think the best arguments for God just are arguments that require or at least entail something like classical theism simpliciter. And it's the mangled mess of Christian theology that seems to add the unnecessary problems with very little justification for them. Here, I would also state once again that during this time, I was noticing that nearly all the arguments from Christians, theologians, apologists, and so forth that seemed to be sound, I think that were robust refutations of naturalism or positive cases for theism were just that. They were positive cases for theism generally. Outside of something like the minimal facts argument for the resurrection and maybe the maximal argument, but that seems to have other problems, I'm not aware of a single sound or even interesting argument that demonstrates that Christianity specifically is true or even plausibly true.
Okay, so this is an objection that lots of us make as well when arguing with apologists. I tend to want to just say, yeah. Okay, let me stop you right there. Let me grant whatever apologetic you're trying to do, just for the sake of argument, just to have a little bit of fun. I grant it all. Now tell me how this gets to the God of the Bible and Christianity is true. And they never can, and they never do. They talk about it being a cumulative case, and that first they have to make the simpler theistic argument that there is a God. But I'm trying to tell them, I grant you that there's a God. I mean, I don't even have to believe it, but let's just grant it, except that take me to Christianity is true. There is no bridge that ever gets you from apologetic arguments to Christianity is true. And I don't care how many scholars you ask this question. I've asked every one of them that I could. There is no bridge.
But who says Christianity is a thing anyway? I mean, it's not Jesus that sets up Christianity as such, is it? He's just he says some wise sayings, etc., and says he's the way, etc. But then it's man later on that just sort of sets up the church and the orthodoxy and sort of garnishes it and calls it Christianity. Even be a thing at the beginning. It's not. I don't think Jesus would recognize necessarily anything to do with the church today or Christianity itself, to play the progressive part, the card. And what the hell, by the way, is the procession of the Spirit?
Okay, so there was a lot of rapid fire theological terminology.
Yeah.
In that, and I would just say, play that back at half speed and set your internet to Wikipedia.
Unless one wants to admit things like appeals to personal experience or just appeals to historical majority, which I honestly get why those can be added as data points in a cumulative case. I just don't think they're enough to get me there anymore. So when I surveyed all of the arguments and evidences and data, theism just seemed unavoidable. And all of the conflict and problems came from the affirmation of Christianity. It's like if you have a house and every month or so a fire starts in the house. And every time, without fail, the fire is started by the refrigerator in the garage. There comes a point where you just remove that refrigerator. You don't sit around and think, well, that refrigerator has been around for a long time and lots of people like it, so I should burn down the rest of the house and keep the refrigerator. Like, why would I go along with the open theist, burn down classical theism, and keep the thing that keeps raising all the problems? That just doesn't seem to be a rational way to go.
Okay, and I love this analogy. He's way better at analogies than me. In this analogy, Christianity is the old refrigerator in the garage. Okay, but if you take away Christianity, aren't you left with Judaism? Don't you? So is that better? I mean, really, how do you just, you take the Bible and you remove Christianity, and then what do you end up with then? It seems like you end up as a Jew. Is there another option? or do you have to take some more stuff out? Because I don't think
a follower of Jesus. That's the other big thing people say they are without being Christians.
Okay, well, I don't think he identified the whole set of things that's causing the fire then. Because it's not just Christianity. Mm-hmm. If you take Christianity out, your building's still on fire.
Now, further friction arose around the biblical tension between emotion versus intellect. And I talked about this previously. On the one hand, God created us to be emotive creatures. And much of the Bible is a call to our emotions. It's really an emotional book. And that's fine. But then when we are also told that the heart is desperately wicked and can't be trusted, when I started doubting and spoke with people about it, the responses I got were weird. On the one hand, if I let my emotions influence my decisions or my thinking at all, well, then I was being emotional and I can't trust my feelings and your heart's desperately wicked and you just need to give in and, fideistically trust in God. But on the other hand, if I just read the Bible, but I had questions and I tried to understand the theological or philosophical possible solutions, well, then I was trusting the thinking of man and I was using worldly philosophy and all that kind of stuff. There's a kind of no-win view of the constitution of man in Christian theology that we should be emotionally less emotional and fideistically rational.
Okay, so
hit the nail on the head. The nail on the head. We've all been there. We've all tied ourselves in knots. It gets too tiring. It's exhausting. Give yourself permission to think. Your heart isn't wicked. That's all you need to know.
Honestly, if you feel the love of Jesus in your heart, and you feel emotionally moved to worship God, is your heart still deceitful and desperately wicked? Or does it stop being deceitful and desperately wicked? By the way, he's quoting a passage from, I want to say Jeremiah. The heart of man is deceitful and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Is the full quote there. And so, it seems like Christians want to have it both ways. Your heart is deceitful and desperately wicked unless your heart is telling you to worship God, and then it's trustworthy. So it is kind of a catch-22. It is exhausting. I did go through the same struggle myself. Am I supposed to be, emoting my way through Christianity and faith, or am I supposed to distrust all of that emotion and just go with the informational approach from, this is what's in the Bible and this is how I should parse the Bible? The churches of Christ, for the record, are very head-based Christians. We tend to be very head-based rather than heart-based because we don't trust all of that emotionalism. So I grew up very much that way, not trusting all that emotionalism. And when I saw other Christians who I thought were going to hell, because they were other, when I saw them, it was easy to spot the problem. You're so emotional. And as a human, you can't trust your emotions.
No, and the charismatics are a little bit the other side, and they're very light on the theology side, and they're a bit more on the emotional side. It's all about Jesus talking to your heart and stuff. Whereas, because I was a little bit more skeptical and not very, I don't get swayed by emotions too quickly like that. That it didn't work on me, so I was questioning it a little bit, but yeah, I feel for him because he's obviously gone through that bit where you're just questioning everything. And is this right? And it's when you've stepped back now in years that I've kind of stepped out of it, possibly a bit more. And even just the questioning of it, like he's doing, is just, you just realize how batty it is and how toxic it is and how it's so exhausting, and
Yeah.
it's so not unnecessary. Just be, and don't worry about all this stuff. You don't need to have it all worked out, and you can trust yourself, because that ultimately is all you've been doing all your life anyway.
Yeah.
You just haven't realized that you've put labels on it, that it's God, and it's probably just been you, and don't worry about it, and you've been doing fine. So
It takes a long time to get there, though.
yeah, it does. It does.
I certainly didn't get there right away.
Further, I started having a lot of issues with the simple fact that God acted and did things in the Bible, but just doesn't do it now, even though if he did, it would solve so many of the issues.
So he's going to make a very good point. And I just, listeners, wake up and listen to this point. You go back to sleep after this. But I've said this many times, and I have never, again, received a satisfactory rejoinder from a Christian. God is so very active in key situations in the Bible. I mean, he wants to leave it so that there's no doubt about his command, his authority, what he wants from you. If you didn't believe, he was very helpful in doing things help you believe. When he called Gideon to serve, you might remember the story of Gideon. Gideon is like, yeah, God. I mean, Gideon knew who God was. He's like, yeah, but could you give me a sign? And then he was able to kind of devise his own test, and God says, okay, I'll do it. And God does it. And the next day, Gideon is like, yeah, can you give me another sign?
He's the fleece guy, isn't he? He's the one with the fleeces.
Yes, he's the fleece guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you give me another sign? And God is very helpful. He's not upset at all. He gives Gideon as many signs as Gideon needs for Gideon to go off and do the stupid fool thing that God wanted him to do. But somehow God is not interested in being that helpful anymore. But I think Tyler says it best. So I'll let talk.
Isn't that because they? I was always told there were different times because they haven't had Jesus yet.
Yeah, but Jesus did signs and wonders too. So
which are written down and that you now have. So what more do you want?
Peter and Paul did signs and wonders. Well,
if you go to the charismatics, they'll do signs and wonders, which is why why we were the real ones and not you.
It's a kind of improbable silence on God's part, but in ways that we know he could and did act those ways before. We're told that on the one hand, we cannot expect to see miracles from God to confirm faith, because then it wouldn't be real faith. Or look at those people who had miracles in the Bible and they didn't believe. Or you cannot demand things from God. And those are the reasons given by apologists for why we shouldn't expect to see miracles. But think of the response to the hiddenness objection, that if God was so present, then somehow we'd be forced into belief. And what God really wants is sincere faith, which, to be honest, I don't know what that means. Since, as I've discussed before, I think faith in the Bible exegetically is a volitional act of trusting. It's a reasonable thing, but it's the act of putting your trust in something. It's the boarding the plane. It's the getting married. I can't unsincerely board the airplane. I either board it or I don't. So apparently God being present and working miracles would not lead to true or sincere.
Park your internet connection to Wikipedia and look up shotgun wedding.
Faith. But think about that. On the other hand, the central faith-making claim of Christianity that sets it apart from all other religions just is the coming out of hiding incarnation of God himself to perform a public miracle that is to be affirmed and attested by those who witnessed it. So which is it?
You got your proof.
Are miracles not good for grounding real faith, or are they necessary for grounding real faith?
Right. But it really is a crazy making idea when you think about it. So if you think about the time when Jesus shows his death wounds to the 10, there weren't 12 at the time, and then Thomas wasn't with them, so there was only 10 the first time Jesus comes around. And he shows them his death wounds. And then later Thomas comes along and he says, yeah, I want to see it too. And Jesus gets a bit snippy with Thomas, but he shows him the death wounds, and he says, yeah, it's better for those who believe without seeing, rather than, people like you who believe because you see. But I always found that to be a bit incongruous. Does Jesus really believe that the apostles would not have believed had he not shown them the death wounds? If so, maybe they shouldn't have been his apostles because he gave them evidence to shore up their belief that he refuses to give the rest of us. So he says to the people that he likes, I will give you evidence, but to everyone else, I won't. And that just feels unfair. If evidence was good enough for them, it's good enough for me. If it's bad for me in my faith, then it should have been bad for them too. This is what Tyler is trying to say. I agree. It's crazy making.
Do miracles that reveal God make people have insincere faith because they're forced to believe, and so God won't do those kinds of miracles? Or does God do those kind of miracles as the core tenet of the Christian faith, despite that some won't believe in the true faith because more people will?
So Saul of Tarsus never becomes Paul the Apostle unless God shows up and personally knocks him off his horse. That transformation never happens without that.
You can't have it both ways. Or think of the story of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5. They sold their land and then gave half the proceeds to the church. Half. But they lied and said they gave all of the proceeds. Okay, so Peter rebuked them, and then God struck them dead. Now, did they defraud the church? No. Not really. It's not like they stole from the church. They weren't embezzling money from the tithes. They gave a 50% tithe from a land sale. They just lied and said that they gave 100%. Now, is that dishonest and vain and maybe wanting to look more generous than they are? Sure. Worthy of being struck dead by God? I mean, I don't think so. And if you say yes, then why does God not strike people dead today who not only lie about what they tithe, which I guarantee is a lot of people, but who actually defraud and steal from the church, who steal from it and use the church to defraud and further steal from the poor? Ostensibly, the very ones the church is expressly commissioned by God to care for, or who use the power of the church to protect pedophiles and rapists and such. I mean, imagine the faith that people would have in the church and the trust that they would have in the church and in God and in the purity of the institution itself if God actually policed its borders today like he did in Acts 5. And why not? Well, the answer will be, unavoidably, that in Acts, it was the early church, and God was protecting it and establishing it with a sign at that time to establish the church. But, okay, why stop? Why not protect the peace and the purity of the church and the God-given commission of the church that he gave in the first place today?
I wouldn't mind hearing what a progressive has to say about that, because whilst you can do the whole, well, it was the, I remember some people saying to me, well, it's the Old Testament. What does that matter? You don't need to worry about that. There's the new covenant. It's all new. It's Jesus, blah, blah, blah. So you don't need to worry what the Old Testament says. So I'd like to hear what progressive has to say about the Ananias and Sapphira story, because that's, you can't sort of quite pretend that's Yahweh having a bit of a fit in the background, because this is the new God and the new story with Jesus's love. And so, did that really happen, or was it just a probably poor old Ananias and a sort of heart attack, and they just attributed it to his lie or his stretching of the truth and nothing more than that. But I haven't heard any apologetics on it from a progressive on that.
So let me direct your attention to contractual obligation, patreon.com/red letters, where I have brought this subject up a number of times, and there you can read in the comments no actual good responses to this. So perhaps there is some place else where Christians are willing to engage this issue. I don't know if the amount was half. I don't know that the Bible actually says what amount it was. It says they held back part of the contribution, and so I actually always got the feeling that it was more than half that they gave. It doesn't matter. They didn't have to give any of it. And so they did. So, his point is well taken. You give generously to the church and you're murdered by God. Or you molest children as authorities in the church and get promoted. This is very incongruous. And his point is why? This is not me just slagging on the Catholic Church, mindlessly. This sort of thing happens in all the churches. Let me just be clear about that. I think it's happened in the Catholic churches, maybe worse, maybe more publicly, maybe more costly in terms of lawsuits. But if you think that you're somehow safe with your Baptist preacher, you are not. And so you shouldn't think, oh, well, it's safer over there than over there. I wouldn't park my kids in either of the places. But once again, the point that should not get lost here is, if this is how God policed his borders then, why isn't it good enough for him to do so today?
In the faith that people would have, imagine the trust that they would have in the institution. Imagine all of the objections that people would go away, that the church is abusive and money honey and greedy and doesn't care for the poor. And all of that would go away, which is a lot of times reasons people give for leaving the church in the first place. Imagine I moved into a new neighborhood with my sons, and on the first night, someone tried to break in. So I publicly beat and executed that person in the front yard for all to see that I was willing to do what it takes to protect my house, ignoring the illegality of all that. Imagine I could get away with it. But then I just stopped doing that. And every night for the rest of my time there, I let thieves and pedophiles come in and ravage my home and my family without stopping it like I did the first night. And the excuse that I gave was, oh, well, I was just establishing my house in the neighborhood when I first got there. After that, sin is sin. And I don't want to prevent the free will of my neighbors to choose to believe that I'm a good father to my family in the first place, or that I'm a good neighbor. Like, how would that be a good reason? How's that a good answer? Which makes me think of another story, by the way. And I've said this one before when I actually still was a believing Christian. This was actually before my loss of faith. I used this example to talk against people who somehow had this very watered down, genteel version of Yahweh in the Bible. But let me say it again now from my other perspective. Imagine that I also knew in this new neighborhood that one of my neighbors was a sociopathic sadist. And one day I see him out and about while I mow my lawn, and I say, "Hey, Joe, how you been? Have you considered my oldest son?" And John says, "Oh, sure." Or sorry, Joe says, "Oh, sure, but you protect him so much. I just didn't try anything. Plus, he'd be strong because he knows you protect him." But then I said, no worries, Joe. I'm actually going to head out of town tonight just for the purpose of not being home. So you can come kill my son's entire family, all of his friends and classmates, burn all of his toys, burn it to the ground. By the way, if you want to come back another night when he hasn't completely rejected me, you can actually inject him with every virus and anything you want, make him as sick as you can. You just can't kill him. And it'll be totally okay, because in a few years, as long as he doesn't curse me for not protecting him, I'm going to give him all the classmates. I'm going to give him even more classmates, more friends, more toys than he ever had before. I'm going to replace all of his brothers and sisters. So it's totally going to be okay.
Every Christian out there, no matter how little they've read their Bible, recognizes that as the story of Job.
I remember when Job made sense, though. Seriously, I'm almost nostalgic for that. Do you remember when you used to listen to that story? God killed everybody, and like, yeah, that sounds good idea. He gives you much more back. That's really excellent. What a good God we serve. He's going to give you new wives and new kids, all brand new. Remember when that made sense? And then, whereas now, for goodness sake, we know it's from the 4th or the 7th century, or, between 4th, 6th, and 7th century BC. We're talking about, really, ancient people. It's it's got 3 authors. It's why does anybody ever think this is literal, yet that you have to take literally? I don't know what you get from Job anymore.
Well, honestly,
just shut up.
Even barbarians back then, but let's just assume a lower state of barbarity than what would have even been there. Even the cavemen would have heard this story in their grunt language and said, "No, that's fucked up, man." Right? Nobody looks at this story and says, "Yeah, that seems right. That seems God."
We did in the 21st century, David. We did it.
I know we all did it. But this is with our minds utterly disengaged and wearing this is what I was talking about earlier. You just have this, this God love centered focus, and you get that drilled into your head, and then everything rests atop that foundation. And so even the most horrible thing that this God does, you see through a lens of, God loves you. You see how he offered his good servant, never done anything wrong, to the devil. You see, God loves you. What's your problem? You see how God let Satan kill off Job's entire family, and they were so insignificant they don't even get names. It doesn't even. They're just non-player characters in this thing. You see how God loves you. Like I said, any one of these things should be enough to get the deconversion done. but that's not how faith works, and that's not how our brain's own faith works. And all I can do is kind of mock some of these things heavily, to kind of cleanse myself of ever believing this stuff and perpetuating this stuff, because I was worse than the average Christian in the pew. I was the fool on stage.
How many?
The only time I ever preached, it was on Job. I'm just saying. And I thought it was a good story.
Or a good human.
Look, it's a lot of Christians look at that as a lovely story, but once again, this is your brain on drugs.
Well, from what I was getting, in any sense.
I'm sorry, I keep cutting you off.
I was going to say, the only thing I was getting from it is how Job prayed to God in his suffering and turned to God, and that was what I was trying to teach them.
He was already with God.
I know, but he doesn't blame God for his terrible things.
He doesn't turn to God. He was with God the whole time. He was never not with God.
I know, but he doesn't question God.
At his most wicked, if you can just say, if you can pinpoint the point in Job's life where he was at his most wicked, he was way better than every other human on earth. There was at no point did he deserve any of this stuff, all the way to the point that at the end of the story, God affirms that Job spoke correctly, that he was an innocent man. At the beginning of the story, God says, "Here's an innocent man. Have you tried him?" So here's a righteous man. It's not here's a kind of righteous man. It's here's a righteous man. This is the most righteous man around. So it was never about some secret sin of Job.
No. But that's the point. What does a righteous man do? He to be in conversation with God, and he doesn't blame God, and he does get a bit angry at God, to be fair, but I don't know, he doesn't. His wife tells him to shut up and stop being a fool, and that God's above all this, and that's what our reaction should be in the face of difficulty. That's what I got from the story of Job. But yeah, when you look at the fact that God just lets this terrible things happen to him, it's not so funny when it starts happening to you.
Of the word, likely none. But that just is the premise of the book of Job. Or imagine that I was a judge, and I claim to be the most fair and righteous judge, and that I do not judge sons or punish them for the sins of their fathers. Now, not that sometimes there are not natural consequences for their sin, right? Because apologists will sometimes say that. They'll be like, oh, well, if someone's an alcoholic, then there are going to be natural consequences for their kids. I'm not talking about natural consequences. I'm not talking about that type of thing. I'm saying, what if I, as a judge, says, I'm not going to visit the punishment on the sons for the sins of their father, right? But then you find out one day that a man stole from me, and so I have him and his entire family executed. That's the story of Achan and his family. Or you find out that once a group of guys said they didn't want to live under my household rules anymore, so I executed and burned them, their wives, their children, and all of the people in their households, which, by the way, would have included parents and cousins and servants and so forth, and I buried a ton of them alive. That's the story of Korah's rebellion. Or that because one father sinned, I make the rest of them entirely sick and guilty, and they are all punished criminals unless they repent. That's the story of the whole Bible. I could give so many examples of this, but the point is that there's huge sections of the Bible that just seem fundamentally at odds with the Christian view of the God who is love. Again, not that God is merely loving sometimes or he acts in loving ways, but that God is what love is, or rather that love is what God is.
So I remember distinctly coming to a very similar conclusion before I completely shut the door behind me, which is that if God's actions in the Bible are what defines love, then that's not any kind of love that I want it to be a part of. And I came to the conclusion, thinking that I was going to get struck down the whole time, mind you, that I am more loving than God. I am more just than God, because I would never consider doing, even if I had the power, I would never consider doing some of the things that God did throughout the Bible. And if I did do those things, if I did have the power and behave like God, people would hunt me down because I was a tyrant. And every day of my life, they would be trying to kill me, and rightfully so. But you put that God in front of Christians, and they bow down. I wonder how much of that is Christians bowing down because they think that God is loving, or they're bowing down because they think that God is terrible and they want to appease him so that he doesn't smash them like a bug too.
Bit of both, definitely. And you are very just, even with your biased moderator privileges.
This podcast is over.
So, again, think of the garden. Not the normal objections that we commonly hear about the age of the earth or why God would make knowledge punishable, which I think there are good answers to. But think about why God set up his creation how he did. A lot of times, Christians seem to conceptualize that God's just dealt these cards, or they just don't think about it. They humans are sinful, or at least to be free, they have to have the option of sinning. And then once they're sin, well, the jig is up. It's all downhill from there until Jesus comes. But think about it for a second. Why? Why did God create the cosmos that way? He didn't.
Why didn't you have this thought 10 years ago? I know I'm.
This is what atheists thinking have been telling him. He's like, I'm not thinking like an atheist, but this is what we've all been shouting at him about, just going, this stuff doesn't make sense, stop it.
I know I just got on to you about this. This is why this has always been right there. It's very low-hanging fruit.
Have to create humans with a covenant head like Adam, such that when Adam fell, so did all of his posterity into guilt and sin and death. God didn't have to create covenant representation. God didn't have to create creation corruptible by human sin. So when Adam sinned, God decided to make it such, metaphysically, that sin impacted nature, corrupted human flesh, so that it's passed on, that there's a sinful disposition, there's a sinful nature, there's original sin, there's original guilt. However your theological system wants to cast it, God made it that way. God chose to make all creation susceptible to sin, and so now it grows thorns and thistles, and it makes animals carnivorous in response, and roll out the carpet for death and disease and natural disasters and murders and genocides, all in the wake of sin. God didn't have to make it so that child cancer and diseases arose because of sin.
Okay, go ahead.
This is what Dawkins has been saying since 2004, and people before him, or 2000, whatever, the new, the horsemen, the four horsemen of the apocalypse or whatever. That this has all been said before. This is not news. This is why it's so weird to think that he was an apologist. This job was literally batting this stuff back across. So he was aware of it anyway, but it's all just, something must shift in people's minds. And I think that's what's happened to all of us, is something just shifts one day and you're like, yeah, that no longer makes sense. It made sense. But say, the Job story, it was fine. And then now suddenly, I can't deal with it anymore. It doesn't make, and I think something just must change, and I don't know what it is. And I think it's different things for different people. For him, for one, I remember you one time writing about the miasma of Adam's sin being left out or to get across the world, and that really just like made me think, oh my God, I've never seen. Of course, there isn't any event like that in history where you see this suddenly happen. So that really resonated for me, and for him, suddenly Adam being punished for everything all the way down the line is batshit crazy, and rightly so. And it's just different. There's something will suddenly resonate with somebody when they just think, yeah, this is enough. I've got to stop now.
Yeah, it's a bursting dam scenario. One drop of water against the dam, the dam doesn't even notice it. Because it's a dam. It's made to withstand lots of water. And so these atheist objections are like one drop of water, or these inconsistencies in your own mind are like one drop of water. But at some point, there's enough water so that the dam begins to leak, and that leak becomes a flow, and that flow becomes a burst, and you don't have a dam anymore. So I just think it's kind of that. And once it starts leaking and flowing and bursting, you look back on all of the things that you defended and you realize, yeah, that was not my finest hour. So this whole thing about sin being the catalyst for the fall of nature, so that we're now born with childhood diseases and such. In computer terms, I equate this to a failure mode. So everyone who is watching this or listening to this right now is using a computer or computerized device, and you have all suffered some kind of failure mode where an app or application or process stopped working. And there are different ways that things can stop working. It can stop working gracefully. It put up an error message which explains very detailed what happened and how you can fix it. No one is familiar with that because that never happens. But that's one thing that could happen. And another thing that happens frequently is that your computer or your phone just locks up. You can't do anything now. You got to unplug the damn thing or restart it. So that's a bad failure mode. So imagine a failure mode where an app, spits of a hairball. And the failure mode is your computer blows up, but before it blows up, it sprouts arms and it injects you with poisons, and it sprouts a fist and beats you in the face. And then it starts ripping your body from limb to limb. And then just before you die, it bursts into flames and engulfs you and your house in fire. Okay, at that point, that's not a failure mode anymore. That's just a demon in your computer. And what he is describing is a failure mode that does not fit. So, right, humans do the thing that humans do. They have the ability to sin, and so it's inevitable, given enough time. If they hadn't sinned then, they would have sinned later. They sin. So what is the failure mode to sin? Is it that, they have to feel bad about what they did and they get a do-over? No. Is it that God punishes them with boils for 3 months? No. Is it that God kills them on the spot and starts over with other humans and gives them a new start? No. The failure mode for one person's sin is to burn down the entire creation with some kind of miasma of sin and evil, where we are now soaking in a fallen universe where sin becomes our very nature and we need some supernatural act to save us. This is not a failure mode, folks. This is a demon acting out. Okay.
Nothing is necessary about the outcome from sin that way. God could have just executed Adam, or he could have just quarantined off creation from the effects of moral decisions, or he could have started over. He could have done a whole host of things. There's nothing that necessitates that because Adam sinned, children would die of leukemia and malaria and starvation. Those aren't necessary correlates, and on and on. The issues just from here, again, just mounted beyond measure. And I could no longer justify paying the interest on that intellectual bill, let alone the principal payments. The interest alone on that became too high. The level of credulity needed to keep nodding along just became way too costly for me. Now, another reason, sorry, I'm going to take a drink here.
Isn't the defeaters to this reason, where you don't know it can't be otherwise, therefore it's true, sort of thing? That was the defeater I heard from a certain apologist.
It doesn't matter. Yeah, it's a defeater that doesn't defeat anything. Exactly. Because if the inevitable conclusion is that humans are going to sin and create this terrible situation, then you don't create humans. Right? Because the God in this case was already perfect. Perfection was reached. Love was reached. He's a triune being, so he could love himself. He could receive, the virtuous circle of praise and adoration through himself. Nothing is gained by creating humans in this world that is going to fall. Now, what at least one apologist I know would say, and has said many times publicly, is that the utility of a fallen universe is the same as God not creating at all. So God not creating would be a perfect situation, but God creating the world falling, many people suffering, dying, most of its inhabitants going to some kind of hell, brings about the same amount of perfection as if God doesn't create.
Straight face.
Right. Well, I'm just.
God.
This is you asked, so this is in fact the answer, and this is the even though I don't think I would have gone all the way there. I would have had to at least consider this as a possibility when I was a Christian, because you have to save God from the accusation of, evil. And, by the time I seriously asked the question, if sin is the natural consequence, why create at all? You know, and sometimes Christians would ask as a kind of a defeater, would you rather not have free will? You know, would you rather just be an automaton, or would you rather have free will? Well, I'd rather be an automaton and live in heaven and happiness. Thank you.
That's what I used to
You know,
think.
if your free will send you to hell, if your free will gives you a 50-50 chance of going to hell, and the chances are much higher than that, but even if it was a mere 50-50 chance of going to hell, I'll take the automaton state. Thank you. So, no, there's no, as near as I can tell, there's no logical, reasonable way to go at this and have it make any sense.
Was just that I could no longer sustain the massive ad hoc Gordian knot tapestry of the attempts to reconcile various biblical passages. It just because too much. It just became too much to keep all the bumps in the carpet down. It kind of reminds me of that funny quote in the Christmas Story when Ralphie's narrating about his old man, and he says, "In the heat of battle, my father wove a tapestry of obscenity that, as far as we know, is still hanging in space over Lake Michigan." I love that movie. I love that quote. In this case, it's not obscenities, but apologists do have to create an obscenely complex and overly ad hoc tapestry of explanations to try and dance around all of the problems in the Bible, to keep it all together, all the contradictions, the tensions, the textual changes, the theological issues, the transmission issues about if we even have what the text is, if what the text says Jesus said is actually what Jesus said, which sometimes seems impossible because what's said in Greek only makes sense as a Greek pun, wouldn't have made sense in the Aramaic, or vice versa. So again, I plan to have several episodes on these, but let me give some examples of all the different facts of all the different stories around. Let me give some examples, such as different facts around the different stories of Jesus' death and burial and resurrection. Here, I agree with Bart Ehrman that often apologists will have to create a whole new gospel amalgamation that actually does violence to the original beauty and theological significance of the original gospel and its original author, in order to try to weave them all together. That is, to reconcile some gospel narratives together. The apologists actually have to diminish the genius of the original gospel author.
Just an example that he doesn't give, but I think that Bart Ehrman does give, the 7 sayings of the cross. You can hear many sermons on the 7 sayings of the cross in churches. You will hear them as Easter approaches. And if you are not studious, you will believe that there were 7 sayings on the cross from Jesus. You will just assume that it is there somewhere. Nowhere in your Bible is there 7 sayings of Jesus from the cross. Not one account of the story lists 7 sayings of Jesus. There's some where he, says this thing here, and he maybe says a couple of things in another account, but over here he doesn't say any of those things. He says this different thing, which is a little bit contradictory and hard to combine with that other thing. And then over here he says, and so what you do to get the 7 sayings of the cross is you just smash them all together, and you create an entirely new account, 7 sayings of the cross.
Okay. A good example of this is when we talk about what day and time Jesus was crucified. In Mark, it's clearly the morning of the Passover at about noon. But in John, it's about 9 a.m., the morning before, on the morning of preparation. Now, some apologists will try to smooth this over, and they'll say that Mark is talking about the Passover. But what John is talking about is the day of preparation for the Sabbath, not the day of preparation for Passover. So they could actually be talking about the same day. That is, if Passover fell on a Thursday night to Friday morning, that would be the day of preparation for the Sabbath. So it could be the same day. The problem is that for John, The reason why he wants Jesus to be crucified on the day of preparation of the Passover is precisely because of the theological imagery of Jesus being the Lamb of God, the scapegoat sacrificed and butchered on our behalf. Well, the significance is only attached to the day of preparation for the Passover and not the Sabbath more generally. The Lamb of God theme barrels through the entire Gospel of John, starting with multiple statements of John in the first chapter, such as 129, where Jesus being the Lamb of God is specifically tied to Jesus's taking away the sin of the world, a clear allusion and foreshadowing of his saving death. This is repeated in 136, and so when Jesus is crucified, it's part of John's theological genius that he ties it to the slaughter of the lambs on the day of preparation for the Passover. The Sabbath is brought in the statement of John not to explain Jesus' crucifixion, but rather why his body had to be removed and buried. And notice that even if you buy the rather ad hoc explanation to reconcile the differences in the days, they still get the hours wrong. One says 9 a.m., one says noon. Now, is that a huge problem? No. In fact, neither would be a big problem if one got the day or the time wrong. I mean, if you ask, or if I ask you 30 years from now about what day of the week or the exact time of day something happened 30 or 60 years before that, I wouldn't blame you or think you were lying or making it all up just because you may get what day of the week or hour it was wrong.
Okay, I've got to stop you right there, Tyler, because Christians, academics, tell us that these people had supernatural memories. I'm sure that you've heard Jonathan McClatchy talk about the supernatural memories that these people had. I mean, oral tradition could be passed on. These long-form writings could be passed on verbatim from generation to generation with nary an error. And so, which is it? Did people forget critical times and days? Or did they have supernatural memories and get it exactly right, and we just have contradictions? You can't have it both ways.
And there's lots of ways to, again, I mean, you can pick and choose whatever explanation you want, like it's the Essene calendar or whatever to make the dates fit, or you can, this isn't news that it's on different days in the Bible, but you can make it fit. And if that's literally been what you do as a living, then why is this news? Why is this like major to the faith collapse? Because this was all known surely from working as an apologist. I don't get it. That's what I don't. It's all these are kind of fairly basic things that get brought up as arguments that apologists have been batting away for donkey's years. So I don't get it.
I'm still going to stick with defending him. In the Churches of Christ, one of the weird, quirky things that many of the churches are known for is that they only use a cappella music in church and worship and not instrumental music of any kind. So that's something that I used to believe naturally. But as I grew into faith, I mean, I'd heard all the arguments. I knew all the arguments. I taught all the arguments. I preached all the arguments. I knew them well. But somewhere in my mid to late teens, it just started to ring hollow. Even though I knew the arguments, at some point, I realized that there was something kind of ad hoc about those arguments. And there were, questions like, why would God suddenly care about instrumental music? Because back in the Old Testament, he was very happy with being worshipped with trumpet and such. They had a full-on marching band going on there, and God was happy with that, and that somehow at the end, in heaven, there would be music and things like that. But somehow during this era, God really doesn't want you to sing "How Great Thou Art" with the accompaniment of a piano. And at some point, I don't care how many ad hoc explanations you just sit down with that thought for a moment, and the ridiculousness of it overwhelms you. So you're thinking, how could anyone have believed it in the first place? But I'm telling you, I grew up with it, and I could have argued. I did argue and defend it. I taught it. I baptized people. So I was pretty good at defending this sort of thing. But yeah, at some point you have a moment of quiet, you have your glass of Kool-Aid, and you're doing some piano practice, because I played the piano at the time. And, I practiced songs that I knew, which was church music. And at some point you got to ask yourself, am I sinning? I'm just practicing the piano, and Amazing Grace is a simple tune. I can practice this. What if I don't sing while I play? Would that be okay? At some point,
technicalities,
right? There's, the wall that's holding back all of this ridiculousness just breaks at some point, and you realize, yeah, no.
Or different than someone else that I asked the same question to. But the reason why this is important is it goes to the broader issue of the kinds of explanations and contortionary circles that biblical apologists are willing to go through. And there's no end to these. For example, the 5th plague of God on Egypt killed all of the livestock of the Egyptians. But the final plague killed all the firstborn of the livestock. But they all died. So how is there still livestock?
So this type of objection that he's making is easily swatted away by Christians, certain kinds of Christians, by saying you're reading the Bible too literally.
Yes.
You see, this is the problem when you read the Bible literally. If you read the Bible like Randall Rouser, he would say, this is just kind of jock in the locker room language. Yeah, we slaughtered them all. Well, you didn't slaughter anyone. You didn't slaughter, you didn't even defeat all of them, but, you won your battle, no matter how narrowly. But then you get this kind of jock exaggeration. That's how they wrote in the Old Testament. And so when it says, he killed all the livestock, it wasn't really all the livestock. And that's why there's livestock later. Like, this is, but this is how Christians think. And this is how Christians are objecting to Tyler today. And they would just say, well, you've run into one of the serious problems with literalism, and you just need to read the Bible the way I do.
Paul tells us in Galatians that at his conversion, he didn't go and consult any of the apostles for 3 years. And only then it was Peter and James, Jesus' brother. In Acts, he goes right away to them and meets most of the apostles. So which is it? What about the cause of suffering? Is it that the righteous suffer to be Christ-like? Is it that the unrighteous suffer as God punishes them? Is it that the righteous suffer while the unrighteous prosper? Is it that the righteous suffer as a means of God to bless them? And so on. Well, it depends on what passage you read. Does God love and want all to be saved, or does he hate some and hide the gospel from them? Depends on what passage you read. Does God hold the sins of the father against his children, or does he not? As I presented above, it depends on what passage you read, and on and on. Now, this does not mean that I think all of the objections made against the Bible are good. Many of them are dumb, really dumb. When someone says the Bible cannot be true because it says bats are birds, I still roll my eyes so hard I might pull a muscle.
Okay, but once again, this is the problem of you're reading the Bible slightly less literally than the person to your right. The person to your right is reading it a little bit more literally, and they're looking at you as if you're the liberal, right? And you're looking at the person to your left as if they're the liberal. This is, once again, though, kind of a blind spot with Christians. I think I mentioned that the Church of Christ has like 5 distinct flavors of its denomination. And I often talk about the mainline or the mainstream churches of Christ. And I've had some significant experience with at least 4 of the distinct lines. None of them really recognize the other. And your idea of where the line of right reading of the Bible and progressivism just happens to be where you are in that line. You know, no matter how conservative you are, there's someone to the right of you who says you're a liberal. So this is
so true.
This is kind of what he is dealing with right now. Yeah, okay, bats are birds. Well, you're just reading the Bible too literally, he says, and the person who is right is saying you're not reading it literally enough.
Like, it's just dumb. And this also doesn't mean that there are not ways to get around or reconcile these conflicting passages. Someone who's creative with sufficient motivation can reconcile any 2 texts together, no matter how absurd or how ad hoc the explanation is. So I'm not saying that there's no proposed answer or solution to them. It's just that after years and years, it started to look like a big put-up job. And while some explanations could be possible, a lot of them are just really, really bizarre and really ad hoc and really implausible. And when you start putting those things together, you start putting bottomless buckets inside of bottomless buckets inside of bottomless buckets and expecting it to hold 3 buckets full of water. There's a problem. The mountain of ad hoc explanations just became too big for me to continue to see it as an intellectually honest exercise for me to continue. Now, before going into my final section, I want to answer and give a response. I want to answer a kind of response I've gotten to these concerns. And that is that these really are only problems for a certain kind of Christianity. The kind that holds to some manner of inspiration or inerrancy, and that rather than rejecting Christianity, I could just go progressive and deny those. Now, I'll admit that is possible, but there's a problem. I just think progressive Christianity is vacuous and self-serving and so wildly subjective that it really is no better than just inventing my own religion, because that's really what it is, or at least what it seems like to me.
So I landed in the same place, except unlike him, I sojourned in progressive Christianity for a little while before leaving the door. And so he apparently did not. We still ended up reaching the same conclusion. So I'm not entirely sure how progressivism ends up feeling like a safe haven. I guess if you are your psychological makeup is that you need some kind of God, you need some kind of supreme being, and you need that God to be bigger than you and the grounding of love and so forth. Progressivism is a nice, safe place to be. But I wasn't looking for a safe place to hide my God. I was looking for the truth. And for those who care more about truth than security, progressivism ends up being a very temporary stay. Did you ever give progressive Christianity a try?
Probably once I'd left, so no, in a way. I suppose I just think that's the only way to view it rationally these days, is to think, well, the Bible's a text to kind of wrestle with, to kind of use as a pointer. So it is subjective, as you say, but it's to give you some ideas, some lessons, some sort of Aesop's fables almost for life lessons. And so it's the only way that any form of Christianity makes sense to me. But is it even progressive? I don't know. I can't get a handle on whether these kind of views were seen before. We might be calling it progressive when actually there may have been periods of time when this was kind of the Bible was used. Because this whole literalism thing is more of an American 19th century invention. It's not the way necessarily the Bible's been seen at all in the past. but I don't know enough about it to honestly comment knowledgeably. But
no, they were pretty literal. A few hundred years ago. I mean, we didn't invent invent right wing. Literalism. That's been around for a while. If you just think about the issue of hell, just as for instance, I don't want to get too sidetracked on there. I know that this is where the comments are going to live because I've mentioned it, and there you go. But the issue of hell, people thought that hell was a fiery eternal torment since, a very, very long time. I'm tempted to say from the beginning, but it's hard to even know where the beginning was when it came to Christianity. But since very early on,
forefathers was a universalist or whatever.
Well, but universalism has been around for a long time too. So the mistake that a lot of we literal hellists make is to say that universalism is the new thing. Well, neither one of them are particularly new. But it's also a mistake for universalists to say that the vision of literal hell is a new thing either. I suspect the literal hell thing is older. And it has certainly been the minority view, I think, for the longer period of time. But if we're just trying to find issues that showed how people thought about the Bible and whether it was literal or not, literal has been around, for a very, very, very long time. Another example would be literal 6-day creation. Well, there had been those in antiquity who didn't think that was literal. But it seems like we have had a longer time with a majority of Christians and other religionists thinking that it absolutely was literal. So, we didn't invent literalism here in America and here and now. It's been going on for a while. It's just maybe a little bit trickier to say whether a conservative literalism is the oldest form. Now, I didn't mean to spend this much time on it, but I will say that there are reasons to believe that literal fundamentalism is the oldest form. And I would say that this is true because this is how all religion works. All religion starts off at in a fundamentalist stage and often gets more fundamentalist before it gets progressive. As time goes on and there's more distance between the creation of that religion, people have the opportunity to believe different things, that, maybe God wasn't literally talking to those people, by revealing secrets out of, in golden plates or, from someone sticking a head in the hat. Maybe that wasn't so. Maybe God really didn't tell Abraham to cut the tip of his dick off. Those thoughts come later. They don't come earlier. So we know that they were literalists because they were chopping their dick off. So that's how you know that literalism reigned. Right? Abraham, Moses, Jacob, these were not progressives. So, and whoever wrote their stories were not progressives. So this is true with all religion. Islam is very, very literal, very, very right-wing, very, very fundamentalist early on, a religion of war, and then it became, over time, a progressive religion of peace. So this is just the normal way of religion. And so I do tend to believe that Christianity is no exception. It would have started off more fundamental, just like Judaism did. And, we loosen up from there. Sorry about the digression. I'm not editing it out.
I get to pick and choose which verses I like, which ones I don't. I can make them mean whatever I mean. To hell with context. I can make them mean whatever makes me comfortable. God's love. So anything that I think is mean or uncomfortable or I don't like, I just cut those out of the Bible, except for Jesus, who I then would have to completely reimagine in my own image to make him more palatable to me personally in the 21st century. But then that would be different morally to those who did it in the 16th century, and those in the 18th century, and those in the 24th century, and so on. So it just strikes me that the progressive impulse today is just wildly Western, often really American, somewhat narcissistic, and culturally tethered, to be completely honest. That is, I don't think highly enough of myself to think that I can create my own Christian religion in my own image. It seems to me the only Christianity worth believing and worth actually having some type of commitment to would be a crunchy, old-timey, robust Christianity of the historically orthodox and theologically consistent variety that takes the Bible as objectively inspired revelation from God. Without that, I don't even know why I would worship God or Jesus, because I don't know why Jesus would have had to come and die on the cross, or why he would have to come again, or why there would be judgment, or why read the Bible at all at that point, to be honest, because I can make it whatever I want. So in the same way that I think views like open theism or universalism are just so utterly untethered from the text and so theologically incoherent and hermeneutically irresponsible, and so I could never see them as a valid alternative, so too progressive theology also just has no appeal to me at this point. Now, the next two objections, which I'll get into, are things that I did not come to believe were demonstrably false, but I just found that I just found that the justifications for them were far weaker than what I had previously thought, and were largely faith commitments in order to really remain consistent in other areas.
And this answers the question that you keep asking: why didn't you leave sooner? But these thoughts happen as we grow and mature, and you look back on the reasons that you believed, and you realize that maybe the reasons weren't as good as you thought you once thought they were.
So what are they? First, the resurrection. Okay, I found arguments for the resurrection that were a variety that I mentioned above, where they committed a kind of Mott and Bailey fallacy in which they sought...
To stop right there, did you know what a Mott and Bailey fallacy was, or did you look it up? Be honest.
Neither. Well, I didn't know what it was, and I didn't look it up. I just assumed it was one of those. I understood what he meant from the context afterwards.
Yeah. So, to oversimplify, by the way, I looked it up.
Okay.
To oversimplify these fallacies, I don't know, man. It's the type of argument where you try to prove a relatively defensible thing and let that also try to use that to also then prove a less defensible thing. An example would be like the writers of the Gospels got locations and distances and geography largely correct.
It's the New York Superman fallacy, isn't it? That just because New York is described correctly in Superman, that doesn't mean that Spider-Man or whichever.
Exactly. That is a classic Mott and Bailey fallacy. So yeah, you get these, some of these details in the Gospels correct, and therefore these are reliable historians who you can trust when they start babbling nonsense. So I wanted to put that out there, because the first 4 times I listened to this, I assumed that I knew what it meant by context, but I realized I didn't, and I needed to look it up, and I wanted the audience to, at risk of mansplaining, to make sure that everyone understood that one.
To demonstrate some uncontested fact, like that the Gospels were historically reliable broadly on things like names and places, but then they try to squeeze some other kind of supernatural or miraculous juice from that therefore all the miracle claims are true, or the resurrection claim, or the theological statements are true, or they would move from the Gospels being early to therefore they're reliable on claiming Jesus rose from the dead. This kind of Mott and Bailey fallacy was pervasive in pretty much all cases that I saw for the reliability of the scriptures, and in some of the cases for the resurrection, not all. The minimal facts case for the resurrection specifically, like those from Habermas, Lacona, and Craig, seem sometimes to commit the same error, not always. But what I found interesting was that even maximalists like McGrew would point this out. So this isn't some kind of super skeptical claim made by the unbelievers. But then what about McGrew and McLatchie's maximal case? Well, in that regard, it's hard for me to see how they aren't just begging the question when they seem to simply presume the theological and supernatural reliability of the text as a basis for the argument to go through. Now, again, I'm going to have full episodes interacting with both minimal and maximal fact views.
He's almost done. Let me just use this as an advertisement for Matt and Andrew's Still Unbelievable. They recently did a show debating Jonathan McLatchie, who was just mentioned here. And since they recently did that show should be out sometime in September, because they are really slow at getting them out. But then again, they're very careful at editing and, trying to put out a good product. Whereas me, when I do a show, I get it out the same day, warts and all. So look out for that one. If I remember to do so when it comes out, I'll link to that, or if someone else sees it, be sure to link to that. I think that Jonathan has been on their show a couple of times, and I've had one occasion to speak with Jonathan myself. So Still Unbelievable. A lot of good content there.
So please don't think that this one paragraph summary interaction with them is my flippantly hand waving them away. I've studied these for years. Again, I'm simply stating the variety of intellectual challenges to my prior Christian beliefs that all started cropping up at the same time and culminated in my deconversion. Okay. The final big category that caused me issues was the atonement. Now, this one is a bit more complicated, and this may have been one area where Reformed theology may have played a role in my deconversion, but only indirectly. And if I'm honestly think about it, since there were other views are more problematic and less exegetically supportable, that therefore, even when I deconverted because of this issue or part of it, and it was in the shape of Reformed theology, I probably would have deconverted sooner and just in a different shape had I been convinced of some other view. Okay,
so one other small interruption I'm going to make here. This is a plea to Brian I. and Marvin. Yeah, I'll make this plea to both of you. So we get a lot of terms like Reformed theology, classical theology, open theism, Arminianism, Molinism. Would one or both of you just take a gander at doing a brief bullet point explainer of all of these things in the comments so that people can follow along and know what the heck he's talking about at any given time? Thanks.
And again, to be even more fair, this may not be entirely a Reformed problem, but it could be an Augustinian or even just an Orthodox problem. So it may not even be accurate to say that this is a Reformed shape issue, but I did find that the consistent proponents of the views, like the ones I'll mention, were primarily Reformed because they were the ones that I found to be the most academically robust and consistent. Now, I put out some posts on my social media in the past month or so, challenging the analogies that people give to try to overcome questions about salvation and judgment. For example, the problem of the analogy that salvation is like a present, and you only experience the benefits if you choose to open it. Remember, I'm going to go into this in further episodes, But basically, the issue I have comes from the problems that arise when we ask whether or not Jesus accomplished salvation or if he merely made salvation possible. I think that it's clear from the Bible that the biblical authors believed that Jesus actually did accomplish the atonement on the cross, that he really did take our sin, paid the penalty due to it, and actually propitiated or turned away or satisfied all of the wrath of God due to the sins that he paid for. So my first issue was that I just don't think that I could rationally accept a view as biblical that held to a kind of escrow or provisionist view of the atonement, that Jesus paid the price in general and in an abstract way, and that his blood is held in some kind of celestial escrow that we can draw on when we believe. Those views are just outside of what I think is exegetically responsible. It also seems to me that some form of penal substitutionary atonement is clearly taught in the Bible, that the view of the biblical authors is that Jesus was the substitute who died in the place of sinners and who took the punishment upon himself.
Yeah, so I have learned to stop using words like clearly and exegetically responsible when talking about the Bible. Because what you're saying, and whether Tyler intends this or not, what's actually being said is if you don't believe this, then you're not being reasonable. You're not being exegetically responsible. You're not looking at this in a proper and appropriate way. And so the reason you disagree is because you are not being responsible with the way you read the Bible. That is how I thought as a fundamentalist. And it's how I thought even after I left the faith. And it's only been recently that I've been able to think in other ways. So I just want to make it clear that just because I read the Bible a certain way now doesn't mean that I've got the only or even the right reading of it, and I do not dismiss other people's opinions and readings of it simply because they have a different reading. I think there's largely no way to know what any given author thought at the time.
Exactly. There should actually be a law that says you can't put the Bible clearly says in a sentence. They shouldn't be words that ever go together because there's no such thing. And I think he says, clearly it's penal substitution. Well, there's plenty of people who will tell him clearly it says quite the opposite.
Right.
The whole problem. And they both think they're completely right about the way they're viewing it, which is actually my major argument for believing that nobody really knows. And so they all think they've got the one way of seeing it. He's right in the sense that progressive way you can sort of pick and choose what you want, but you genuinely can, because there's so many views out there that you just take from the buffet whatever you want.
Yeah, and honestly, if it is clearly one way in the Bible, then what are you saying about people who have a different view? Mm-hmm. You have to be saying one of two things, neither of which you really want to say. Thing number one, they're insincere when they read the Bible. Thing number two, they're stupid. I mean, you got two choices, and there really isn't any nuance. If it's clear, if it's obvious what is being said, you either purposely don't want to know or you are mentally incapacitated so that you can't know. So it's, for that reason alone, should probably avoid things like clearly the Bible says.
Make it law. Make it law.
If only.
He died in their place and procured their salvation then on the cross. The biblical authors viewed him as the actual savior of his people, not a potential savior of a faceless group. Now, other views of the atonement may be correct, such as a moral influence view or a government view or a Christus Victor view. But I take it that those views would be true in tandem with the penal substitutionary view. They don't undermine it or replace it, but they augment it. That the atonement in the Bible may accomplish more than the substitutionary view, but it doesn't accomplish less than that. That it may be more than a legal or a commercial transaction, but it isn't less than that. And so it seems that for those for whom Christ died, forgiveness and the turning away of God's wrath for sin has been accomplished already. Okay, so then what? Well, why then do any who do not believe suffer wrath in hell? It seems to me that one must commit themselves to either some kind of universalism or a limited view of the atonement, like what we find in Reformed theology. However,
so the limited view of the atonement, once again, this may not be familiar terminology to you. It makes perfect sense if you're a Tulip Calvinist, which Tyler used to be. So he's speaking from that perspective. But this is one of these things that I've also kind of recently come around to. I don't believe the Bible teaches it, but the question is, why not universalism? Why shouldn't it be universalism? So he's going to talk about that a little bit as it comes to an end. Love to have a little bit of discussion about that in the comments.
If universalism is true, then it's unclear on how we should read huge sections of the Bible. So Christianity may end up being universalistic, but biblical Christianity is not. And again, see my comments above about why I think the only type of Christianity worth believing is biblical Christianity. So I'd have to give up the Bible, I'd have to give up what the Bible I thought on that view anyway, which I mentioned above, would just be a view that isn't appealing and would feel like throwing out the inspirational baby with the atonement bathwater. Now, I'll talk more in later episodes on universalism and why I would reject it, even if one is willing to reject the Bible. But for now, again, let it suffice to say that it seems to me that the only kind of Christianity worth believing is the one that does have some kind of significant revelational claim that does not turn that very same revelation into kind of an incoherent subjective wax nose. But what about the other side? What about the Reformed side? The
wax nose. Wikipedia is your friend.
Limited atonement side. What was the issue there? I mean, wouldn't the limited atonement solve the tension? Well, sort of. And it's why Reformed theology probably actually preserved me in the faith longer than I probably would have had I affirmed some other view. But then the problem here was just why? Why couldn't God just atone and supernaturally regenerate all people? I mean, he could have his own sufficient reasons, like for his own glory, or display mercy to his people, like in Romans 8, sure. But why not display mercy to all people so that they all still could give you glory? Why not atone for the fallen angels? Are they not moral agents either? Well, I think Reformed exegetes are far more hermeneutically sound and actually exegete passages in a far more accurate way than their non-Reformed kin. It didn't resolve the theological issues that such a view entails. Basically, if the Reformed view is true, and I think it's more likely true than its competitors, and it solves way more of the issues, it still entails some other problems, such as, why isn't universalism true? God being in absolute control and having the ability to call whomever he desires and regenerate all whom he wills, that would be the best grounds for universalism possible. But that's not what an exegetically responsible reading of the Bible presents.
Stop saying that. Sarah, this is a tangent. We're almost done, and I don't want to forget it. So, you were like a wacky Pentecostal. I don't know what the proper term for that is.
Wacky Pentecostal, wacky charismatic.
Yeah, you believed in angels and stuff. Did you believe that the angels would have a chance to repent?
A third went off off with the other guy. But no, I think they would. Well, no, because they all became demons, don't they? Presumably,
Right, but why wouldn't the demons have a chance to repent?
Oh, because they've gone too far. At some point, they've gone too
They're
far.
going it's too far.
So,
I mean, they're
it's
free
just-
will creatures, right?
No, they're under Satan's influence. I thought.
Well, wait a
They're
minute.
just his
Weren't they
ultimate
free will
autonomy.
creatures before?
Yeah, before, but now.
Okay, so
by
so when
Satan.
Satan has overtaken you, you're not a free will creature?
Yeah, you're just a conduit for him. He's just
How is that
having
different
his
from
fun.
humans who are overtaken by Satan?
Well, exactly. You want to avoid that.
Okay, but humans get a chance to repent, right? I mean, there's an
Yeah.
opportunity for repentance for humans. So what I'm trying to understand is why the angels would be different. He mentioned angels just now. Why would angels be different in that their course was set and they had no opportunity to correct their course?
Their course was set, so he thinks it's like a Calvinist, the elect for the angels as well, do they? Or does he?
I don't know, because I don't know of any Christians who think that angels have a path of redemption. But I'm wondering why angels wouldn't have a path of redemption. They are just like
they've
us.
seen too much, man. They've seen too much. They've been there. They had their chance. They got to the heaven thing and they still rejected it, which was a concern to me because how good is it up there, really? But, yeah, no, I never really worried about angels. They had their chance. They blew it. Sodom.
I take your explanation, and my response to that is the expression on Tyler's frozen face right now.
Which is what the Reformed scholars are best at. Do you see the tension? So the view that I think takes the Bible the most exegetically, responsibly, and seriously means that it also cannot simply dismiss the passages about reprobates and judgment and damnation in the same way that the universalists and the progressives do. That is, it's precisely because I think that the Reformed view is so true to the text and won't treat it like a theological wax nose that I found the tension to be insurmountable, and it can't answer it because it can't avail itself of the same type of answers that the ones who don't take the passages as exegetically responsibly can. Okay. With all that said, I'm going to wrap up this episode. I'm going to go to the questions. I do have some discussions again on coming up on the books in the coming weeks, dealing with divine determinism, compatibilism, divine hiddenness, and so forth. So if you like this content and want to see more, please hit the subscribe.
Okay, that's good. Okay, I thought that was fairly brilliant, frankly, despite the pushbacks that I had. And in fact, the first time I went through it, I thought, this guy's cribbing my stuff. I should write a 50-page book just on this video and these arguments. And I still might, because I like writing words that apparently nobody reads. Can't help it. It's what I do, writer. So, yeah, I thought it was very well argued for the most part. And I certainly recognized where he was. I have been largely in that same place along my journey, a few different routes, and I wish him well. I really do. I don't mean to take his story and use it in some kind of exploitative fashion that he would not approve of. And if you want to come on the show, Tyler, and explain your some of your views more, or provide some pushback or clarification, you are welcome to do that. skepticsandseekers@gmail.com. Drop me a line. Anyone can drop me a line. Did you have any final thoughts about this, Sarah?
Final thoughts. I suppose. I just, yeah, he's. I wish him well. I hope he can find his way. I'd suggest he chills out and not worry about trying to work it all out. Even just taking off the Jesus glasses, and he's pulled all the threads and he's pulled the Jenga game, and the whole thing's kind of collapsed around him, and he's kind of trying to get it back in order, which we all did, and we try to where do I fit now and stuff, but. I just encourage him not to worry about it, and just to look at the fact that very few people, no one really knows the answer to these life's big questions, and the Christians just pretend to, or believe they have faith in it, but they have. And there's other worldviews, and don't worry about it. Just be agnostic. Is what I suggest. You don't have to work it out. It's fine. Chill out. When you're sitting there debating about some of these things, and this was said, and then this is said when the further you step away from it, the more you feel like you're just arguing about how many angels can fit on the head of a pin. It's just pointless. No one knows.
Yeah, I would echo that, Sarah. I think that's something that we all need to take to heart. The fact is, none of this is clear even when you're a Christian. It really isn't clear, and you're putting out a heroic effort to try to figure out what this invisible God wants from you, what he wants you to think and know and do. It's so much sweaty effort, and at some point you realize that half of what you think you had right was wrong. And you don't know where to go. And I would just offer this. If it was really that important that an invisible God had some very specific things that he wanted from you, it's on him to let you know, like he did with Paul or Gideon. It's on him. It's not on you to put forth all of that exertion to figure out what still small voices are saying in your head. And so I would just advise what Sarah is advising, which is love and live and be in this wondrous universe, and find connections that aren't invisible and that actually matter, and that can make a difference in your life, in the lives of others. And be open, whatever be open means. Stay open, so that if one day some supernatural being really does have something for you, you'll hear it. But until then, dare I make the satanic creed: eat, drink, and be merry. That's all for now. Thank you so much, Sarah. I am looking forward to next month when we do this all again. And to all of you, we will see you next week. It's everyone's favorite Brit, Matthew. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.